really important things, only upon later reflection as we looked at the mess in the trunk of our cars, did we realize that we didn't actually grab the most important things, but they felt so important at the time, What's the most important thing? What are the real things that we so often miss out on? What is the truth? What's the most important thing? What is the truth? This is what Pilate wants to know in our reading on this last Sunday of the church year, this Sunday we call Christ the King Sunday. Jesus said, I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Then Pilate responds, what's truth? Of course, if you listen carefully to what Jesus is saying, he's pointing at something. I came into this world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Then Pilate's what is truth has everything to do with Jesus as king, at least what Pilate would think of as king, for Jesus is the truth. His kingdom is not, therefore, about determining the truth, but it is the truth. His kingdom is not content, but it is character. His kingdom is not ruled by a king, but it's ruled by commitments. His kingdom is not a thing. His kingdom is a person. That's the point about the argument between Jesus and Pilate. If we had the longer version of this trial, you'd come away with the sense that Pilate going in and out between the accusers and Jesus the accused, it's actually Pilate who seems to be on trial here. The point is that kingdoms past and present are known by certain criteria. When we picture kingdoms, we picture perceivable splendor, don't we? There are impressive things that we can point to about how kingdoms should look. What should kingdoms look like? They're based usually on wealth and opulence, privilege and power, authority and grandeur. That's what kingdoms look like. Rome, now there was a kingdom. And yet, the kingdom that Jesus speaks of is a kingdom that can be anywhere, any time that kingdom behavior is exemplified, any place kingdom character is lived out, wherever and whenever God's kingdom can be heard or observed wherever it is. That makes Jesus' kingdom incredibly hard to pin down for someone like Pilate, but remarkably capable to be present anywhere, even in the most difficult times, even in the darkest places, even right there in handcuffs, standing before a judge. And that's what Pilate misses, what most of the world usually misses, and sometimes passes us by too. What Pilate misses is that Jesus' kingdom was never a place, but a perspective. It was never an established rule, so to speak, but is a stated reality of how we live a life. Never a fought-for hierarchy, but an eternal way of interpreting the world and embodying such a way of seeing everything that we do. This is the kingdom and the king that Jesus is. We are taught, though, to imagine kingdoms as nations, right? I mean, we're all caught up in this, as territories, as landlocked empires. But instead, when we follow Jesus, his kingdom is more like a way of life. It's more a commitment to love and to liberty. It's as a persistent seeking justice. It's seeking freedom for everyone and for all creatures. You see the difference? Now, Pilate, like he understood kingdoms. I mean, he was a mid-level manager of the biggest kingdom in the world at the time. He served a kingdom, an empire. He had a king. His name was Caesar. And he spent so much time listening to earthly kings, and he knew that often they were not interested in the truth at all, but half-truths, convenient truth, false truths, fake truths, and the kind of truths that tap into insecurities and fears. You know, the Pax Romana, it was enforced by violence. You hear the truth? Does the truth set you free? Maybe if you're living in Rome, Italy at the time, but certainly not in Jerusalem, Pilate knew that this way of leadership wasn't real leadership. But Pilate was also, as a mid-level manager, he was so afraid of failing at keeping the peace in Jerusalem that even when he came face to face with the truth, he would still have it crucified. Even towing the line, Pilate will eventually be recalled and end his life in obscurity. And you kind of have to feel for Pilate. You know, after all, what happens when kingdoms are confronted for their wrongs, defied for their abuses, is, well, you end up looking like Jesus on that Friday. And we really aren't far behind Pilate. You know, as I sat and thought about how odd this is, as a Sunday where we lift up Christ the King, and you think we'd be singing the Alleluia chorus, and we get this story from his trial that's going to end in execution. You start thinking about the characters, and you start thinking about who Pilate is, and you kind of got to feel for him, because if we're really honest, he's taking the easy way out. And how many of us take the easy way out? I mean, we aren't far behind. We sort of only listen to the voices that we really want to listen to, you know. We call it an echo chamber now, you know. Maybe it's MSNBC or Fox News, and we begin to spread those things, these well-calculated half-truths, as if they're actually gospel. We may be more interested in our own opinions or our own politics than we are some teacher 20 centuries ago. Because, well, it's easier, right? It's easier. Even among Christians, most of us are just fine letting Jesus doing the heavy lifting, imagining that he really meant for us to demonstrate his kingdom here and now by our lifestyle we're not so sure about. We like him as a savior, but we're not so sure about our leader. But he really meant for us to follow him in a life and a lifestyle like his. He really meant it when he said if we wanted to follow him, we would have to pick up our own cross and follow him. And why don't we do that? Because anything is easier than that. Instead, we want to make Jesus like an earthly monarch who makes it, easy and safe for us, rather than leading us into truth, into compassion, into service, into love for each complicated, difficult, often broken other person that's around us to whom he calls us to love. We want Jesus to save our souls, but we want him to leave our lifestyles alone, a little too much mess in Jesus. And that leaves Christianity in America and in today's world looking crazy, hypocritical. Our commitment's broken and the life of Jesus unlived. And why? Because we're like Pilate, including me. It's just easier. You see, it's easier to condemn an innocent man to death than to seek the truth that might lead to justice. It's easier for Pilate to listen to his own echo chamber, the need to secure Jerusalem and to quiet riots, than to engage in a conversation with the one man who is before him today in our gospel reading, this one man who's going to immortalize Pontius Pilate. And it isn't going to be a pretty immortalizing. He wasn't remembered for his seeking truth or his just sentences, but his collusion with empire and his half-truths with violence, for his cowardice and his need for the quick fix rather than the hard truth. And so every time that Christians gather, every Sunday and sometimes Saturday nights and sometimes Wednesdays too, and if you're really fanatical, Fridays, and we gather together and we remember the name Pontius Pilate. Every time we recite the creed, we tie him to his spin on the truth, his cowardly violence, his inept leadership, and we remember that he rejected the truth and put to death the Holy One of God because it was better for him. It was easier for him. And it was some version of the truth that, he could live with. And yet this truth that stood before him in Jesus would rather die at Pilate's hand, die for Pilate's sake, than to take Pilate's life, because in this king's eyes and in his kingdom's rule, even Pilate, somewhere deep down, was still fundamentally a child of God. And this Jesus, this truth, taught us to love even our enemies. Following Jesus in a life like his is not easy. It calls us from lukewarm, which is, it's really comfortable when it's lukewarm, right? I mean, everybody bathes in lukewarm. Nobody bathes in super cold or super hot unless you need therapy. And the rest of us just like it lukewarm in our lives. But it requires our hearts to be large with love, doesn't it? And it invites us into something that is an adventure and a way of living that most of us are not accustomed to. The way of life in a tradition of following Jesus, the crucified King, the true leader. But it's easier to live under authority. You know, oftentimes some of you say, "I just wish the Lutheran Church weren't so fence-sitting." You know, we used to think that about the Lutheran Church. We just sat on the fence. Just tell us what we're supposed to believe. It'd be a lot easier to live under authority when decisions are made for you, when the rules and regulations are clearly defined, instead of what we do, which is this: we'd like you to consider. We'd like you to think this through. You have freedom to believe what you're going to believe, but we would really like you to engage your mind in thinking about these topics. And here's how we, as a whole church, come up. But you know, you don't ultimately have to believe that, but you do have to think about it. And you have to have a preacher come up and say, it's easier to follow Pilate than it is to follow Jesus. And all of us go, "Oh man, is he talking to me?" It's a simpler life, a less challenging life, and a less risky life to accept monarchies instead of living into the truth that is Jesus. The kingdoms of this world, we have a phrase, follow the money, right? The world banks on sowing suspicion, right? And authorizing otherliness. It makes it how we understand ourselves better. The way of the world depends on everyone for themselves alone and suspicion of others. I mean, that's just bred into us. The kingdom of this world insists that hierarchies will establish successful rule, and that ladder mentality, many of which all of us are, I guess, kind of climbing, that's what keeps people in proper places, and that's what is achieving and accomplishing leadership. Not so with the truth that's Jesus. For Jesus' kingdom, he chooses relationships. Jesus' kingdom chooses the perils and predicaments of living in the flesh, incarnate, fully human, God with us, in the mess, God under human judgment, standing behind and before a human king, even though he is the King of Kings. God giving the divine life for the sake of the world. Jesus' kingdom tells the truth about, well, the truth that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That God so loved the world that he loved every complicated and imperfect creature in it. Even all of us Pilates, and some of us who play Judas from time to time. And this is the good news of that kingdom, is that all can participate, and all are invited, no matter how messed up and screwed up our lives can get. No matter what missteps and mistakes we make, they don't have to be fatal in this kingdom, and you don't have to be incarcerated and stretched for your life in a dungeon somewhere by this king, but to receive the furnace of forgiveness and to come into useful witness in the kingdom. You see, Jesus, he's the real thing, not Coke, no matter how good I thought it was. But we're like Pilate, are too often busy looking at lesser things of lesser importance, and we think that they're the ultimate things, like Coke, better than Pepsi. But then they introduce things like Diet Coke and Coke Zero. Are they the real things too? And we get distracted in our world and chased after things that seem like the real things, but they aren't, not even Coke or Pepsi. And the point of our lessons today and this apocalypse, remember last week, what the definition of apocalypse is? We have two lessons of apocalypse today, the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation. The word apocalypse means the revealing, to reveal. It reveals to us that Jesus is the real thing. He demonstrates real leadership. This leader will lay down his life for the people, for a broken world, for a broken justice system even in